Welcome back to the Madison Advisory AI podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Verner Thompson, founder of Madison Advisory AI. This show brings together leaders navigating the new frontier, where technology and AI are accelerating decisions everywhere, but judgment, trust, and execution still decide outcomes. Today, we're talking about a topic that sounds technical, but is actually deeply human: why adoption lags even when the technology is ready, and why AI is changing that equation right now. My guest is Gregg Bauer, an electrical engineer by training with an MBA from Warren, who has built companies, invested across markets, and now leads venture investing and company formation at Scale Up Labs across health tech, advanced manufacturing, and energy sustainability, including deep work in Latin America and Europe. Gregg has lived the story of IoT before it was even called IoT, and he has a clear point of view on what finally drives real adoption. Gregg, thanks for being here.
Thank you, man. It's good to be here.
Gregg, to start off, can you give us the arc, the 2-minute arc of your journey from engineer to corporate to startups to venture and now Scale Up Labs?
Minutes? Sure, I can
Yeah.
I can do that. As you said, I am an electrical engineer. I had decided early in my engineering career that I wanted to pursue the commercial side of engineering versus the technical side of engineering. So I started my career with Rockwell Corporation in technical sales, which advanced me through the various roles that had and ultimately led to getting my MBA at the Wharton School. And after MBA, I transferred to Boston and decided that if I was going to be living in Boston, which is a startup hub, that I ought to really explore the opportunities to do a startup. So I left my corporate career, much to the chagrin of my wife, that felt that I had lost my mind. Maybe I did lose my mind at the time, but did my first startup as part of doing my first startup. Did three, and the last one was an IoT startup, as you mentioned. It was back one of the very, very first IoT startups. It was called Exceeda Systems, and we were fortunate enough to take that company public. And after exiting that company, I decided that I really wanted to get into the investing side of the venture or of the startup world. So formed Spinnaker Venture Partners with some other partners in the Boston area, and that's evolved over the years into what's now Scale Up Labs, which is a venture originating firm. In other words, we have a venture studio, and we also do venture investing, and we have an acceleration program that we run between Latin America and Europe and the United States to provide entrepreneurs from those markets an opportunity to scale to the United States and to raise capital in the United States with the commensurate larger capital raises and opportunities for IPOs and other liquidity events.
Okay, let's jump into the IoT before it was IoT part of your journey. Back then, it was machine to machine or pervasive computing. What problems did customers actually care about solving beyond the technology itself?
Well, customers, and there were early adopters, really, really early adopters at that point in time. And in fact, Exceeda Systems, previously called Emation, was one of the very, very first companies in this pervasive computing market, what we now call IoT. And it was purely evangelistical in terms of the work. The customers didn't know what problems they wanted to solve because they'd never had an opportunity to solve them before. So we had to first explain to them what the technology was capable of doing, and then really suggest to them what problems that they had that we could address. So it was very evangelical at that point in time. The initial problems we solved were primarily what you would expect, which is remote diagnostics and remote troubleshooting and maintenance of equipment. And initially, that equipment was in the medical device space, testing equipment, X-ray machines, MRI machines, lab devices that did blood testing and other sorts of testing like that. That was initially where our markets were found.
And what did IoT really unlock for medical device companies or the remote monitoring
Well,
companies?
initially, it gave them the opportunity to understand what a problem was developing so that they could dispatch a service technician and so, or have the appropriate equipment parts there to solve that problem. So it was really preventative maintenance, more than preventative maintenance. It was prescriptive maintenance
Yeah.
that they were doing. That ultimately evolved into just from understanding when a problem was going to occur to actually providing those maintenance services remotely. So that's initially where it started off at. It evolved from there into a whole host of other types of services and new lines of revenue for those customers.
And does that speak to the fact that mentioned it really enabled new business models?
It did.
And can you give a clear example of how that evolved?
Probably the best example of that would be the medical testing situations, blood and urine and other sorts of testing, where they were using reagents in order to perform those tests. And in most cases, the customers bought the machines, and the companies that made the machines would also sell them the reagent. But there was always that leakage that occurred because the customer said, "Well, I can buy the reagents to use in this machine from someone else at a lower price." So consequently, they really had a hard time maintaining customer loyalty and stickiness to their relationships. So what the IoT gave them, or pervasive computing, gave them an opportunity to do is to change that business model so that they would, sort of like the razor blade razor situation,
Oh,
they
yeah.
would give away the machines, and then they would sell them the service of that machine on a per test basis, and that way they assured that they were being had greater revenue from the opportunity to sell the reagents, charge on a per test basis, and create a great deal of stickiness between the relationship between the laboratory and the machine manufacturer who made the reagents as well.
And
So,
that business model is really stuck. That change, it still exists today.
no pun intended in stock. Yes, that business model has really stuck, and that's where a lot of IoT solutions are at today.
Okay. And when you look back, what do people most consistently misunderstand about why adoption may fail even when the technology itself clearly works?
Well, just because you can make a technology to solve a problem doesn't mean that someone else is going to say, "I'm going to buy that technology to solve that problem." There are many reasons why that doesn't happen. In those days, some of it was infrastructure. In other words, we didn't have high-speed internet in those days. In fact, many of the machines had to be sold with cellular modems in them so that they could connect to the machine. So connectivity was a real problem initially. There's the risk. Corporations hate risk. So consequently, nobody gets fired for saying no. So so there was that perceived risk that occurred there. There was we as human beings, we get very used to doing things in certain ways, and it's very difficult to get us to change. So consequently, there was that resistance to change that occurred. And the resistance to change that not only occurred at our customers who were making the devices, the machines, and so forth to do it, but the resistance was at their customers as well. I don't want you connected to my equipment. I don't want you knowing what I'm doing. I do proprietary things, so consequently, if you know what I'm doing, then I run the risk of you sharing it with my competitors. And so it's the typical adoption curve that most new technologies go through. Interestingly enough, AI is not going through that adoption curve. So,
And why do you believe that or think that's true?
well, I
It's
know
different for
that's true
AI.
because if
Okay.
you look at the number of users okay, it took roughly, I don't know, 26 years for the internet to reach the number of users that AI has reached in 3 years. So if you look at those two adoption curves, they're dramatically different curves. Now, why is that? That's a question that would probably would take longer to answer than we have in this conversation we're having today. But it's there's not a lot of the way that AI is particularly large language models, so the chat GPTs, the Claudes, the Geminis, or the other large language models that people have become perplexities, there's not a large risk to adoption there. In other words, it's uh, it's it's free or almost free, so there's not a lot of
Yeah.
risk,
Okay.
and it's delivering value in different ways. In other words, the value that you and I may use it for may be research, it may be helping to do creative writing or correct creative writing and so forth. That's one set of value. There's a whole nother set of value that it's delivering, which is editing my photos and or making new cartoons or whole host of things, getting recipes. It's a different set of values. But because the infrastructure is already in place, in other words, the internet is already in place, the high-speed internet is already in place, and because the cost of using it, the cost of adoption is almost free, people are in fact using it. Now the question comes down is how are those companies that have developed these large language models going to put in place a sustainable business model that allows them to generate the revenues commensurate with the kinds of capital that they've had to put into the infrastructure, into the technology to do it. That's a whole different question. So is that adoption curve sustainable? That's
And that's evolving as we speak. And OpenAI just started their own ad system, and we'll see how that kind of competes or how they differ from Google Ads. And I think that'll change the way people are interacting, at least with ChatGPT, knowing that ads will now surface, at least for the free version.
yeah. Well, I think where you have with OpenAI is trying to compete with Google,
Yeah.
who their Gemini, who have used a completely different business model that's much more aligned with the business model that Google has always used, which they are so well practiced at using. The question is, can OpenAI can OpenAI catch up to Google?
And that'll be interesting
Do they have the
to
resources?
see.
Yes.
So it AI in general has changed the way, not even the way, it changed what we were able to do with data. And is that part of the reason that it's evolving more quickly and being adopted more quickly?
Yes and no. If you have to put that question that's just asked into context. If you if you look at that from the context of a consumer or a you and I and how we might use AI, the answer to the question is yes. If you look at that question from the context of a corporation or a small to medium business, that answer is still being written. Part of the reason that large corporations are slow at adopting artificial intelligence solutions today is because of data concerns. The data concerns in that they don't have data in uniform ways that make it easy to access, so they can really make use of their data, because that's what they
Mhm.
really want to do, is make use of their
It's
data.
their own. Mhm.
Or so because their data is messy and it's siloed and it's scattered all over the place. Or uh, the other concern is data security and data privacy, because they're very concerned about that data represents, in many cases, their competitive advantage, not unlike what we saw in the IoT days. So
Right.
that data represents their trade secrets, their know-how, their experience, and they're afraid that if they were to put that data into the hands of OpenAI or Google or someone else, they don't know what's going to happen to that data. Is that data really going to be secure? Is it going to be private? Is it going to be used to train the models so that someone else can take advantage of my data?
Mhm.
As
And I think
consumer,
across
and-
healthcare, that's a big concern. We're not gonna jump into healthcare just yet, but across healthcare systems, one of their largest currencies is really the data that they have, and the privacy of that data is very important,
well, there's a HIPAA laws and so
and
forth that
Mhm.
ensure that in the United States, and in many other countries as well. They're not called HIPAA laws there, but yeah, you don't want to go
Mhm.
into healthcare just quite yet. But yes, that's true. That's one of the concerns is That's one of the concerns and one of the holy grails is that
Right.
data.
Agreed. Some of our listeners may not see the immediate wins of AI in the manufacturing industry. Where do you see the big wins in that industry?
Well, I think the big wins in that industry are places that we're not looking quite yet. If you look at the adoption rate of artificial intelligence in industry, and I'm going to speak most specifically to large industry today, hey, only about 7% have commercialized their AI initiatives yet. Another third are in trials and so forth, and that leaves about half. It's actually more than half that are either not doing anything or are a little bit are frozen in place in terms of where they want to go. So that leaves a large percentage of them are really undecided in terms of what they want to do about it. Now, where is AI going to be valuable? I think we think at Scale Up Labs that AI is going to be valuable in different ways. One is we've been talking about large language models.
Mhm.
Large language models have their place, but they don't have their place as much in industry, in the operation of businesses. That's where small language models and agentic AI are going to start to come into play. And so think of it as why would you drive a Ferrari to work when a Honda Civic can get you there uh, just as fast and but more efficiently and more comfortably. That's the difference of small language model and a large language model. Small language models are predefined and require a minimal amount of training to start to develop valuable returns, whereas large language models require massive amounts of training. Small language models solve that problem of data security because the small language model is on your premises. It doesn't go off your premises. So your data is always your data. You can start to think about how that data is used, how that model is used in different ways. Because now you can start to say, I'm going to train that small language model on my data that makes my manufacturing operation, my small and medium business, makes that is my proprietary data, my secret sauce. I can start to train that small language model, and that properly trained and properly configured and I'm really simplifying this a lot. That small language model can become a coworker. It can become
Yeah.
it can become someone that you work with who embodies all of your tribal knowledge, so that when a machine operator, a customer service person, when they leave the business, they take all of their knowledge with them, their tribal knowledge with them. Well, the small language models can start to retain that tribal knowledge so it can be accessed very, very quickly and very efficiently in a way that can help you run your business on a day-to-day basis. So if you're making widgets, so you make widgets,
Okay.
and there's a particular customer that you've made widgets for, and that customer hasn't ordered in 2 years. And John, who used to run the widget machine, John has since left. And you don't know how to set up that machine, and you don't know how to make those widgets, and you don't know how to order the raw materials necessary to make those widgets, and you have to figure it out all over again. That's not very efficient. But now, if John is augmented, John's knowledge has gone into a large language model, so that when Bill comes in, the new employee to run that machine, it's as if John is standing there beside him. And John knows how to set up the machine. John knows where to find the raw materials to make the parts. John knows how to run the parts. John and so forth. So therefore, these AI starts to become not this great big monolithic thing that large corporations tend to look at it as today, but it starts to become a series of coworkers that are constantly with your business and constantly learning and constantly augmenting your employees to do better.
And do
So
you think that model or thought process is being implemented as we speak, or is something that's we're soon to see in the future?
I think it's something that is being implemented as we speak and something you're soon to see in the future. And one of the originations that we have in our venture studio is a company called Corello that is doing exactly that for small to medium businesses. So what I described to you wasn't something that is um, something Greg dreamed up in the dark spaces of your mind somewhere. It's something that's really happening today.
That's interesting because that there is a gap between small and medium businesses and how and their approach to AI and their ability to invest in AI versus the large corporations that are in the trenches of their own development right now. So that is a very interesting premise.
Well, the large corporations, they do it like large corporations do. They do everything. They tend to do everything really big. So they tend to they'll hire data scientists. They'll have the reasons that they're running into problems and challenges in adoption is they have unclear ROIs. They've got we mentioned before data security and privacy concerns. They've got issues related to people training and people's skills and so forth. There's a whole host of reasons that that large companies are challenged with the adoption. All of them know they
Yeah.
have to adopt it, but if you talk to, and we do, talk to the CEOs of large corporations in in confidential conversations, you'll find that the thing that scares them the most is the thing that they know they have to have the most, and that's artificial intelligence in their businesses.
Right. And I think for large corporations, there is a cultural element of the adoption. And speaking of cultural elements in general, how have you perceived or how do you see any cultural differences between the adoption of AI in the US and then the adoption of AI in Latin America?
It depends on the sector. Um, we see the adoption of AI in the US being much more widespread. In other words, it's covering just about every sector and and um, and many roles. Now, granted, the adoption is still at the beginning, but many sectors, many roles. In Latin America, we tend to see it most often in financial services. We see an awful lot of health tech um, startups in Latin America.
Oh,
The large corporations are adopting it, but they're adopting it at a slower rate even than what's happening in the United States so far. Europe tends to be a little bit more widespread in their adoption, but again, you tend to see it. Um, we're seeing more in the manufacturing sector in Europe. We still see it in health tech. We still see it in financial services, but I would say U.S. lead, Europe is about a year behind, and Latin America is probably 2 years behind
in terms of adoption
in terms
overall.
of adoption. Yes.
And you've said that the US exploits risk where other markets tend to manage risk. Can you delve into that a little bit further?
Well, that's from a capital standpoint. The U.S. capital markets are capital markets that are driven by large amounts of capital and driven by liquidity events. So whether they be liquidity events as a sale of a business or whatever, or whether it's an IPO, liquidity events. So that tends to drive a higher tolerance towards risk. We the capital markets in the US tend to say we're going to exploit risk because if you exploit risk, then you have the opportunity for greater returns. You also have the opportunity for, since you're exploiting risk, you also have the opportunity to lose. But hopefully you're smart enough to do it and doing it that you win more than you lose. In the in Latin America and Europe capital markets, and I'm talking about the capital markets that support the entrepreneurial world, startups, there's less capital and there's less tolerance for risk. So where American investors tend to be valuation investors. In Latin America and Europe, they tend to be cash flow investors. So they're trying to drive the companies towards a positive EBITDA as fast as they can, and they make their money on the dividends. So it's smaller amounts of money applied in smaller amounts, tranches, towards with a push towards profitability. Whereas in the United States, it's larger amounts of money applied in much larger tranches with not saying profitability isn't important, but saying profitability comes, but you first have to establish a value, establish the value in the business. You're trying to
Okay.
drive that business to as high a valuation as you can get, and you make your money on the liquidity events in the businesses.
And because of the capital risk differences between the US's outlook or approach and Latin America, Europe, do you think that's influenced the growth of AI because the capital has been allocated in different ways in those markets?
Yeah, I think it has. It definitely has. We have companies that we have invested in Latin America that are now raising capital, raising rounds of capital in the United States at and they're raising much higher amounts of capital, much higher valuations than they ever would have in Latin America. So consequently, it stalls it amplifies the growth of those companies in the United States, and it reflects back into Latin America because those companies are going to as they grow, they're going to invest in opportunities or people here in Latin America. So they'll create job opportunities for them, and economic development occurs. That wouldn't occur if they didn't have access to the U.S. capital markets.
Mhm.
So yes, it does. It does.
Do you
I
think
think
AI has influenced worldwide economics in any which way where it's made it easier for companies in Latin America to increase their profitability or be more proactive with their earnings because of AI capabilities?
yes. I mean that, but what I just said about the way about raising capital in the United States when they and internationalizing their businesses. That's also true whether or not they're AI company, whether they're AI companies or
Okay.
standards based companies or companies that are making widgets. I mean, that's also true. If they're solving a problem that is truly a global problem or an international problem, then they have the opportunity to do that. If they're solving a problem that's purely a local problem, well, then it's much harder for them to do that.
That makes sense.
And I
Okay.
don't know that AI is necessarily alone responsible for that drive. What is happening is, and this is particularly true in the United States, to a certain extent true in Europe, is there's massive amounts of money that are flowing into AI companies that look real. Now, much of that money has flowed into the infrastructure companies. And there's become and much like happened in the internet bubble years ago, it's happening in AI. There's this circular capital flow that's occurring. Is is OpenAI is investing in NVIDIA, Oracle's investing in OpenAI, NVIDIA is investing in Oracle. It's a circular capital flow that's occurring. Um, that's happening, and also these larger amounts of capital being deployed are also happening. Now, is that creating an AI bubble? Um, that's a question that's often asked. You haven't asked it, but I'm gonna answer it. Yeah, it is creating an AI bubble. However, because I think it's gonna be difficult for some of these companies to achieve revenues that are going to match their valuations. We talked about OpenAI. It may be
Mhm.
very difficult for OpenAI to ever achieve revenues to match the amount of capital that's had to flow into OpenAI. But it's also creating, I don't think that I'm not worried about it. We're not worried about that bubble because AI is opening so many new possibilities for companies that are solving real problems that are going to be applied AI, much more applied AI. Some of the things we talked about with the small language models and some of these kinds of things, agentic AI, which is emerging, is is going to are going to offset that bubble, just like happened back in the dot-com days. So it's all going to even itself out.
Okay. Well, that'll give our listeners a little bit of ground to work with.
One problem, one problem, we see this with the companies that we are looking at for the accelerator companies we're investing in, is artificial intelligence has made it very easy to launch a new application. You can go onto Claude, you can program. I could program a new SaaS model in 2 hours that would have taken 2 years to make before because I can. But I can't, but people can. But because there are so there because the potential is largely unlimited, the the challenge people have is they're making companies that they think are cool, but they're not solving a market problem. They're not solving a market problem that's big enough. So that's the challenge that the startups are having today, is just because you can build it doesn't mean that anybody's going to care. It's like the old prop. It's the two hardest questions for any startup entrepreneur to answer, and they seem like such simple questions, but they are the hardest questions to answer. And those two questions are: so what? Who cares? And to be able to answer that question, you have to be able to look yourself in the mirror honestly and answer that question honestly and say, well, wait a minute, just because I can do it, maybe nobody cares. And the reason that's hard for a startup entrepreneur, particularly an early startup entrepreneur, is because in order to answer those questions honestly, you may have to admit that your baby's ugly. And nobody wants to admit their baby's ugly. So
Agreed.
that's the problem that's happening today, is companies that are building it because they can, but they're not doing their homework first to find out if they're really solving a problem that anybody else cares enough or is big enough to justify the kind of investment they're going to need in order to build a business from them.
So let's land this in healthcare, where incentives and complexities are very extreme. On the business side, reimbursement, billing integrity, and denials, between all of that, where is AI really helping?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. We have a company that has come out of our studio called HealthQ. And that's exactly what HealthQ does. Is HealthQ helps with the entire denial issue that the billing has. So, as you know, healthcare billing in the United States is done by codes,
Hmm.
and if a procedure often has many codes that go with the procedure itself, and if that procedure is not coded exactly right, and it gets to the insurance companies often will deny that claim. And of course, it's to the benefit of the insurance company to deny the claim. And it gets kicked back to the provider, and the provider then has to sort out what's wrong, figure out what's wrong with the codes, sort that out, make the appropriate changes, get it back to the insurance company, see if the insurance company will acknowledge it. And oftentimes that's a volley back and forth 3 and 4 times, oftentimes ending with the provider saying, "This is not worth this. I'm spending more time and trouble in trying to get this claim fixed." So about 30% of claims never get paid. Which translates to, I don't know exactly, but I'm going to guess hundreds of billions of dollars in lost um, revenue to the providers, which of course translates to higher healthcare costs for all of us as well, because they got to recover that.
Hmm.
So, what HealthQ does is HealthQ is using AI, applied AI, to look at the claims that the providers are making in the context of the insurance company that they're making it to, and advising the healthcare provider how to adjust their coding, because the coding is done manually. So how
Hmm.
to adjust their coding to ensure that that claim has the greatest chance of being paid. And when
Yeah.
it's kicked back, it then will look at it in that context and say, aha, here's what's wrong with it, which saves some poor uh, um, coding person somewhere all that time trying to figure out what the claim is. So that's a classic example, and that's a company that we built in the lab in order to do that.
And a lot of companies spend an incredible amount of time and money with the back and forth between denied claims and trying to prove that back to the payers. On the diagnostics, wearables, and mental health side, when it comes to AI, what's real in your opinion and what's hype at this moment?
There's a lot of real stuff out there right now. I mean, again, this is one of those areas where people are solving problems that may not be problems, but it's also one of the areas where people are solving problems that um, are major problems that are going to change the quality of life. Example, where we're seeing a lot of it we're seeing an awful lot in mental health, both mental health and neurodegenerative disease, neurodegenerative brain disease. Um, because in mental health, they're looking at things like voice patterns and eye movement and so on and so forth to predict mental health problems well in advance of them being, or maybe not well in advance, but not requiring that the person go to a mental health professional first to determine whether or not they have a problem. It gives them an indication that, yes, you probably have something going on, and you can then seek a professional's help to do it. In the case of neurodegenerative diseases, things like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, dementia, these kinds of things, we've actually uh, brought a couple of companies through and invested in a couple of companies. One company is called eSteps. eSteps is a shoe insert, like an insole that goes in a shoe, and it could detect the early signs of multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease well before a diagnostician would detect them in a person's gait or in a person's movements and so forth. And it uses AI to do that. And it's a simple shoe insert that does that. We've invested in another company that is using um, voice patterns, vo- uh,
Yeah.
subtle changes in voice patterns that only AI can analyze to detect early signs of dementia and early signs of Parkinson's disease as well. So there's an amazing amount of things going on in AI. So you've got an example there of a wearable,
Hmm.
and an example of voice recognition that's being used. We
And
have
mental
another
health.
in mental health. We have another initiative that we co-founded called Social Impact Partners. Social Impact Partners is all about the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's, so on and so forth. And there, you've probably heard the term food is medicine. Their AI is being used with patients to help prescribe dietary modifications for them that are specifically tailored to them to help them with their early stages of their diseases.
Wow. So, I mean, that's real world application and something that impacts longevity, life, and overall well being. So, I think that's incredible what's happening.
I think in the area of medicine and healthcare, AI is going to change um, the lives of our lives in the future for the next 10 to 20 years in ways that we can't even imagine.
If you had to give leaders one principle when it comes to AI, how do you scale AI while still protecting human judgment?
So you're bringing in the the ethical portion of it as well. I think there's a number of steps to that. One step, first of all, is understand what you're going to do. Completely understand the problem you're trying to solve and and the role that AI is going to play in that. Second thing is bring a diversity of thought into the evaluation of that solution. And when I say diversity of thought, bring in the people that are going to use it. Bring in the managers people. Bring in the legal group. Bring a diversity of thought so you can look at that solution and say, does that solution, A, does it solve the problem? B, does it solve the problem equitably? C, does it solve the problem from a human-centric point of view? We went back to the coworker thing again. AI isn't replacing people. AI is augmenting people. I think that's a basis that needs to be followed by all corporate leaders when they apply AI. Is the AI augmenting people or is the AI replacing people? One of the things that I don't know about what I'm going to say is true, whether what I'm going to say is it's actually a fact, but we've seen an awful lot of corporate layoffs recently. Amazon and I don't remember FedEx or UPS. I think
UPS.
UPS let those people off. And they all say they're being laid off because of AI. I don't believe that's true. I think AI is being used as an excuse. I think what's happening is that these are public companies and they're being pushed by their shareholders and by their boards to improve their earnings. And so they can use the excuse of, I'm sorry, we're going to lay you off, Amanda.
Hmm.
They're being replaced by AI. Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I
You
think
think
it's
AI is the scapegoat,
I think
really?
AI is a scapegoat. Yes, I do. Not in all cases, but I
For
think in some
this one.
cases it's being used as a scapegoat.
I love what you said that AI is augmenting people, not replacing people. I think that that rings true, at least for my thought. And I think the more that leaders really lean into AI augmenting people, the better use cases they'll find.
I think that's true, and I think that is, it's like any new technology. The automobile was gonna replace the drivers of horses and buggies. Every new invention, the steam engine was gonna replace people in factories. It's every new innovation has always been said it's going to replace people. Has it replaced people? Has the internet replaced people? No, the internet's created more opportunity for people. AI is going to create more opportunity for people. And we're in that early stage where, that really early stage where we as human beings haven't figured it out yet. Governments haven't figured it out yet. It's AI is being blamed for being a massive consumer of energy. And it is.
Hmm.
Now the data centers are. Small language models are. The data centers are. And they're going to require more data centers. But what is that doing? That's not worsening. Truly, it's not worsening our energy problem. It's not worsening our environmental problem because it's forcing the innovation to occur that needs to occur anyway. So it's forcing the innovation of small package, intrinsically safe nuclear power plants that are the size of a tractor trailer. They could drop beside these to develop absolutely clean, perfectly safe power. It's going to improve the efficiency of our electrical grids in ways because if you can control the electrical grid so much more precisely than that, which is
Hmm.
going to support the ability to deliver that clean power and versus having to build more. It's going to help us to develop better solar cells. It's going to help us to develop better wind generators. It's going to help us to possibly make tidal energy a reality because it's going to help do the analysis and do the development that it would take years for us to do by ourselves. It's augmenting human beings. It's going to make our life better. It's not going to
And
make our life worse.
and I think that that's a great example of how AI is pushing us forward in ways our listeners may not even be thinking about or imagining. And it's happening in all different industries in all different ways. So Greg, thank you for being here. I think this has been such a grounding conversation. And AI doesn't replace judgment. That's really stood out for me. And AI doesn't replace people. It augments people, like you said. It also lowers the cost of insight and decision making when it's being implemented thoughtfully. In your perspective, having lived IoT before it was IoT and pervasive computing, really brings such a depth topic overall. So, for our listeners who want to learn more about your work, we will include links to Scale Up Labs in the show notes. And thanks, as always, for listening.